Knights are the most baffling piece on the chessboard by far. I often liken them to the 7 times tables, where our brain just doesn't have a good handle on how they move and an intuitive sense of where they're going to go next. So I wanted to give you 10 quick shorthand rules of thumb to use when playing against knights to help just tame those beasts. Let's jump in. So the first tip I wanted to share is around the knight's square. So the knight's square is a 5x5 square around the knight of where it's going to go in its next few moves. So I thought this was just a really good way to visualize like where the knight can attack in the coming days, let's say, for example. So the way I've outlined this, the red squares, high peril, that is where this knight is attacking right now. So that is the squares that it can reach within one move by just jumping there. So any king in here is in check. The next layer down, where can it get to in 2 moves in this square? Further afield, it's kind of always going to be 2 or 3 moves. But within this kind of close quarters, these orange squares, it's going to take it 2 moves to get to. So not quite in the zone of danger, red hot danger, but in a little bit of peril. So you want to be, conscious of that. The knight can get there in 2 moves. Now, the blue, right in close quarters with that knight, is actually a pretty safe zone. It can't get there for 3 moves. So a very, very safe one, relatively speaking, to be in close quarters with the knight there in this sort of cross section around the knight. And these corners of the square that I've marked out here, this 5x5 square, these 4 earthy brown corners, they are uber safe. So it's actually going to take the knight 4 moves to land on any of those squares, or 3 moves to even attack those squares. So you know that you're safe if you've got your king in that kind of corner. And that's going to take us to our second tip, which is exactly that. If you find yourself, let's say for example, in check here by this knight, and you have a wealth of options to choose and you're in time trouble, a very quick way to nullify this knight is just to move your king into one of those lovely squares away from the knight's zone of influence, also known as one diagonal square away from the knight. So just one diagonal away, you're safe as houses. It's going to take him 3 moves before you can even check your king again. And that's a lovely place to be, a good quick decision to make in time trouble. Now, in our next example, let's say for example they have taken that square away from you, so you can't reach that one diagonal away square. What is your next best option? This rule of thumb is something that I use probably the most out of any of the rules that I'll cover today. When attacked by a knight, if you move to a square of the same colour, the knight will not be able to attack you in the next move. When you're making those quick fire decisions, move to a square of the same colour as the one your piece is on at the moment, and the knight won't be able to attack you again, as long as you're moving out of the knight's zone of influence, because every time the knight moves, it changes the colour complex that it's going to attack. It can only attack one colour complex at a time, so if you move out of its reach onto the same colour, its next move is going to be the other colour complex that it's attacking. That's our third tip. If you can't get the one square diagonal away, move to a square of the same colour. Now, speaking of colour complexes, that brings us on to our next tip. And my next tip is forks only happen to pieces on the same coloured squares. Forks only happen to pieces on the same coloured squares. So again, if you're worried about a knight fork incoming, then you just, or 2 pieces, let's say for example here, our king and our queen, these are in grave danger of being forked. The knight can come in here. And again, if you see that coming, you're like, okay, I want to move my king. And it's just hard to wrangle where the knight is going to move next. Just know that forks can only happen to pieces on the same coloured squares. So if you see a fork coming in like this, the knight jumping in here, and you want to move your king, you don't want to move it here because the fork is still going to happen. So again, very quickly you can say, okay, once I move it to a different coloured square, then these 2 pieces aren't going to get forked. Now, I know what you're thinking. I just said in our previous example, when attacked, move to a same coloured square. This is slightly different. This is regarding 2 of your own pieces. If you don't want them to get forked, keep them on different coloured squares. Very useful in the end game when you just have to make a lot of quick moves and you don't want your pieces to get forked. So forks can only happen on the same coloured squares. Our next tip. So our next tip is regarding knights actually being pretty easy to nudge away from defense. So knights are not the most stable defender, and there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that, as we mentioned, in close quarters around the knight, like this little square here, the knights don't really do much in short order. They have to move to be able to offer any sort of influence immediately around them, which makes them ripe for attack by the pawn. So again, in this pretty farcical position, the best move for black here is actually kicking the knight away, because once the knight moves, and the knight again is defending this square, which is about to be checkmated by our nice little battery here. The knight is defending this, and so the first reason is the pawn can get up and close and personal, and the knight won't be able to take it. Doesn't have any manner of taking it. And our next tip, kind of a 2-for-1 special. So again, let's just play this out. If the knight moves, we just checkmate there. That's fine. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, again, going back to this kind of color scheming. Our next tip is these red ones. This is the zone of peril. I've just jumped into the next move. Let's say, for example, our knight moves to this red square. So it moves to one of the places it could have. Its next zone of peril, marked out in orange here, you'll notice that all of these orange squares, where it can move in 2 moves, none of them are the same as the first set of squares it could have gone to. So every time a knight moves, it completely changes the set of squares that it's covering. So as a defender, if you have, let's say, a number of pieces trained on a pawn that you're trying to win, and you see that one of your opponent's pieces defending that is a knight, dislodging that knight will guarantee that it no longer defends that piece, because if it moves, it will change entirely and completely the pieces that it covers. Hope that all makes sense. Next tip. So our next tip is actually about restricting your opponent's knight. And I've talked about this before, and GM Robert Hess talks about this a lot in his games. All kind of comes back to where the knight can go on its next moves. But a very shorthand rule of thumb is a pawn 2 squares in front of a knight is a great way to stop it advancing into your position. That's a very good thing you want to do. Knights are not long range pieces, so if you can keep them in their own territory, they remain defensive pieces, or they remain central control pieces, but they don't necessarily join the attack until they can actually get there themselves. Unlike rooks, bishops and queens, which can do it from miles away, knights need to be in the thick of it. So just placing a pawn 2 squares in front of a knight keeps it at bay as best as possible. You're not always going to be able to stop it, and it can circumnavigate you, but this is just a good rule of thumb. A pawn 2 squares in front of a knight, good coverage, good little shorthand for coverage. And our next one, on that same topic, I won't berate you with knights on the rim are grim, although I will say it right now. But this knight can only move here, 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 here. 4 squares, a paltry 4 squares. And what you'll notice about all these 4 squares, as with knights, colour complex is very important with how they work and how they operate. All of these 4 squares are on the same colour complex, and they're all on 2 connecting diagonals. So if you do see an opponent's knight on the rim, a bishop here, 2 squares in front of it, much like the pawn 2 squares away from the knight previously. But if you see a knight on the rim like this, plonking a bishop 2 squares away from it like that actually completely limits its motion. That knight is just completely dominated by the bishop, also known as being buried by the bishop. That knight is completely buried. Okay, our next one. Our next one is a more general rule of thumb, and this is one that I read from Wilhelm Steinitz. So Steinitz was one of the earliest scholars of the game. He's a former world champion, and he was kind of one of the first to formalize a lot of rules. And he had these rules of play, and one of them was, when dealing with your opponent's knights, take away their outposts before they can land. So a knight outpost is a square like this, where this absolutely wonderful knight is never going to be attacked by a pawn, and even the pieces aren't too well equipped to attack it as well. So this knight is going to just cause damage at its leisure. The reason I show this game is this is actually from a game in which William Steinitz allowed a knight into his position from Mikhail Chigorin, and he lost his game a few moves later. It was just a complete desecration. But again, it kind of also shows, like, we all have these rules of thumb. Sometimes the situation calls for us to break them, sometimes it doesn't go that well. But in this case, Steinitz broke his own rule of taking away an opponent's knight outposts before it manages to land in them. So doing things like putting a bishop in front of it, putting a pawn in front of it, these are all things that like work towards taking away knight outposts. So hopefully that all makes sense. Take away their mobility and you'll avoid an absolute catastrophe like this. And our final tip is, in general, there's often a hot debate between which is better, bishops or knights. Computers and grandmasters generally tend to agree bishops are a teeny bit better than knights. But where that actually flips is in closed positions like this. So closed positions where there are a ton of pawns on the board and there's not a lot of room to operate, not a lot of open diagonals, this bishop becomes really, really weak. And this knight, it's not like abundantly strong, it doesn't have a huge like immediate plan of action, but because knights are much more flexible, and in closed games you have a lot more time, so that kind of makes up for how slow he is. This knight is actually going to cause a whole lot more problems than this bishop is ever going to cause for white. So much so that if we run the analysis on this, despite the material being quote unquote equal, all 8 pawns on the board, 1 bishop, 1 knight, the computer actually has white up +1 in this, so a whole pawn of material, just by virtue of the position is closed. This knight has more mobility. So while normally you don't really want to trade your bishops for knights, in a closed position you might want to do that. You want to give away some of your bishops and keep some of your knights, if the opportunity presents itself. So those are 10 quick rules of thumb. Some of them hedge on each other. There's 10 in there somewhere. And that is a great way to be able to just dominate your opponent's knight play, because they're all frustrating and nobody likes getting forked. So hopefully this helps you to stop getting forked so much. And let me know in the comments if there are any other tips that I've missed or anything that isn't quite clear for yourselves. And feel free to subscribe and stick around and make my day. And have a great day in general. All the best.